Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to this Oceania semester event. Today is really biology department day in terms of our guest speakers. Dr. Jason Willand is presenting now on the Great Barrier Reef, and then Dr. David Penning at 11 o'clock on a toad and snake invasion, ecological disasters caused by invasive species. Terrific title. We appreciate greatly when our own faculty have expertise in the country or region that we're celebrating. And I don't think we could have an Oceania semester without a presentation on the Great Barrier Reef. And fortunately, Dr. Willand has some expertise in that matter, so we didn't have to go to Australia and fly in an expert. We have our own expert right here. So, this is a presentation I've been looking forward to. I think everyone has a fascination with the Great Barrier Reef. Professor Scott Cragen back in the corner has been there and has sent photos that will be included in this presentation. Dr. Willand is an associate professor of biology and environmental science. He's been on the faculty since 2014. He's quite active in campus life. Just last May, he and Dr. Scott Wells led a student study abroad trip to Belize. I also appreciate Dr. Willand. Go ahead and stand up, Jason. He's wearing the official colors of the Oceania semester today. I mean, you couldn't pick a more perfect outfit. And finally, for those of you who want to enter the drawing for a $1,000 study abroad grant, I'm going to give you the event code for this presentation. It's 1803, and if you want to take the survey, there's a QR code inside the brochure and also a URL link. And you can't take the survey until the presentation is over, but then it will be opened up. And again, the more events you attend, the more times you can enter the drawing for the $1,000 study abroad grant. So again, the event code 1803. So without further ado, let's bring up Dr. Jason Willand to tell us about the Great Barrier Reef.
All right, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so first line of business, extra credit. If you are here for some extra credits for attending my talk or Dr. Penning's talk, Dr. Penning here in the front has the sign-in sheet. So before you leave, be sure to sign. I also want to point out one of these is just a general extra credit. The other one is specific to my class. So please fill out the correct one. Thank you. So this morning's talk on the Great Barrier Reef for me was inspired by my trip this past May to Belize, where I got to visit the second largest barrier reef system in the world. So I'll talk about the largest barrier reef system in the world this morning. So just to kind of give you an outline of what my presentation is going to cover this morning. So I'm going to give you kind of some background on the Great Barrier Reef system, talk about coral that actually build the reef system. So we have hard corals, we have soft corals. We'll talk about those that actually form limestone. We'll talk about protecting the reef from human usage. So one of the first things I want to talk about before I get into the really depressing part of my talk will be how they have set up kind of zoning systems. So then we'll get into kind of the depressing part. We'll get into coral bleaching. I'll spend some time talking about probably the greatest threat to reefs, not only in the Great Barrier Reef, but throughout the world. And I'll talk about some of these other issues that the Great Barrier Reef system is facing, and we'll talk about outlook on the future. So before I start, when you think about Australia, I think everybody probably thinks about something or some things differently. So for me, as a biologist, what do I think about when I think of Australia? So maybe you share some of these, maybe you don't. All right, sharks, particularly the Jaws type. So I'm fascinated and also completely terrified of sharks. But when I think about Australia, you hear about great white sharks and surfers. Not a good combo, right? All right, the eastern brown snake, the most deadly snake on the continent of Australia, second deadliest snake in the world. All right, following this theme of just creepy crawly animals, the funnel web spider, the most deadly spider in the world. Its venom can kill a man in 15 minutes. So they're not only venomous, they are aggressive. So if you can picture a fairly large black spider chasing you, this is not uncommon. All right, kangaroos. And not just kangaroos, but kangaroos fighting. What I love more than anything is watching a kangaroo drop kick another one. All right? So, cute, cuddly animal. All right, now, if you grew up in the 80s, like me, Crocodile Dundee was probably your first exposure to Australia. All right? Paul Hogan. Now, I think for everybody else, maybe we're all very familiar with Steve Irwin. Okay, so again, kind of for me, when I think about Australia, I think about Steve Irwin. So, kind of a mix of all these things. So, it was probably later on when I started actually getting more into biology, when I started thinking about Australia, not just from animals that will kill you, or from movies or from TV, but from this very large, diverse ecosystem that's found there. So when we look at the Great Barrier Reef, if you go into the ocean, I always like to think of the Great Barrier Reef and other reef systems as tropical rainforests that occur in the ocean, because they are so incredibly diverse. So the structure that is formed by these animals creates habitat for numerous fish and other invertebrate animals. So just to kind of give you an idea, we're looking at what is the diversity in the Great Barrier Reef. So we talk about plants and animals. So the numbers of kind of the major groups of plants and animals I have here, and just kind of some snapshots of what would be maybe the more kind of profile type organisms. So these numbers are far greater than any other reef system that you might visit in the world. So we look at some of these numbers like bony fish. So fish basically with a true backbone are going to be somewhere around 1,700. We start looking at some of these invertebrate animals, it's even larger. So things like mollusks, so think about clams and such, and sponges. So these animals that basically, when we look at them, they don't look like an animal, these filter feeders. So they are really some of the high-profile organisms when you visit any reef system that you're going to see. Now we start looking at the Great Barrier Reef and look at its size and look at its extent. So this system runs, if you were to follow this, pretty much the entire coastline of Queensland, Australia, which is this large province in the northeast corner of Australia. And so this itself basically is very diverse, and if you kind of follow this out past this reef system where you've got the Queensland Trench, we have basically a whole other suite of coral reefs that occur out here in the Coral Sea. So if we kind of measure this area from north to south, this is about close to 1,500 miles kind of in coverage, and this isn't just kind of one continuous reef. This is a system of over 3,000 reefs, about 1,300 islands. And so to kind of give you a size perspective, if we look at what we can fill in this area, basically this would take up the size of Great Britain, Holland, and the Netherlands, all kind of combined. If you kind of take these countries, you can fit them in here. So when we look at the building blocks of the current Great Barrier Reef, so today it basically sits on what we call the continental shelf off of Queensland. And so our present day reef has been building for approximately 40,000 years. And over 40,000 years, if you're familiar with geology, you know that we've had ice ages. And so ice ages reduce sea level, it returns. So as ocean levels would recede, coral reefs would die off, only to kind of leave building blocks for further reef systems. So our Great Barrier Reef and a number of other reef systems on the planet are kind of this combination of current day reefs and those from the past. And again, if you look at a number of factors. Well, why is it that this Great Barrier Reef system is so huge? And why is it not just one continuous mass of coral growth? Well, we can look at things like the geology. So again, what I just kind of mentioned with sea level rise or it receding, climate. So we know that if we look at the climate over the last 40 to 50,000 years, it has not been the same. We've had warm periods, we've had arid periods, we've kind of returned to more normal periods of rainfall. So currents and tidal forces. So our ocean currents, if you're not familiar, in the northern hemisphere, ocean currents go clockwise. Southern hemisphere, we go counterclockwise. So these currents are following wind patterns, and so we can kind of, with predictability at any point in year, we can look at how these are going to cycle through. So these are going to help carry not only debris, but these can carry these little living organisms called coral in here that I'll talk about later for movement. So when we look at the variations, if you go north to south throughout the Great Barrier Reef, there's not going to be a lot of variation as far as like the coral species and really a lot of the animals that you're going to find in there. Numbers and areas will be a little bit more diverse, but you cross over that continental shelf, you go into the coral sea is where you'll start to see the big differences comparing what one reef system looks like to another. Now, breaking apart the Great Barrier Reef and looking at component pieces. So I mentioned that we don't just have this one uniform reef system, that there's a number of different components. So if you start kind of from the shore and you kind of start moving out towards the open ocean, first thing that you're going to encounter are what we call fringing reefs. Fringing reefs are basically, these would be fairly young reefs. These are going to occur in shallower waters, and they're going to be a lot more patchy in nature than some of these larger reefs, more continuous reefs, as you kind of move out into the open ocean. Typically, when you look at a fringing reef behind it, you may have a small lagoon or basically none at all, depending upon how far out this is developing away from the shore. So some of these reefs typically are going to kind of form on stuff like sand, gravel, or any other sediment that, again, during our last low ice age, about 20,000 years or so ago, were deposited there. Now, when we start looking at more of these reef systems that, when we look at pictures of reefs, what are they? So most of these are probably going to be something like a platform reef. So these are going to form out on the edges. And behind these reefs that form kind of on these edges, behind them you will start to see these more sizable lagoons. And these can vary in depths from like 3 feet all the way up to about 100 feet. So these are going to be very common throughout the Great Barrier Reef as you run kind of north to south. Now, if you've got these platform reefs, you can have these structures called coral caves that may form out behind them. So a coral cave, these are also going to be variable in size. So these may be simply these ephemeral sandbars that wash in or are washed out pretty easily. To those that may look like a sizable island, sometimes maybe a half a square meter in size or so, or sorry, half a square mile. So these are formed when we look at our platform reef, and we have basically from the top and from the sides you have erosion. And so this is going to carry sediment. A lot of it is going to be probably pieces of dead coral that have been kind of broken and washed back. So these are going to accumulate on basically the lee side or the back side, if you will, of the reef. And so these basically just over time can develop into these small islands. So I mentioned kind of pieces of coral or shell materials from probably formerly living organisms. Well, you also get a good amount of sand, which will contain a number of small microorganisms that typically probably have a lot of silica in them. And so these will form kind of the bedrock or the base for the formation of these caves. Now, a structure that's pretty unique to the Great Barrier Reef when we're looking at these components would be things called ribbon reefs. And so, as the name implies, these are going to be these very long, narrow reef systems. These can run upwards of 18 miles in length, and they can be about maybe a half a mile or so when you start looking at their width. And these form along the continental shelf, and if you kind of look at the edges of these, they start to curl inwards. So we have kind of tremendous growth as far as coral and other organisms kind of on the outside here. So we've got these warm ocean currents that are stimulating their growth and forming them basically towards the insides. Now, if you were to visit the ocean floor on either side of these ribbon reefs, what you're going to find is, because of these strong ocean currents, there is not going to be basically growth of anything. So we have kind of these abrupt stops, if you will, in coral development. So you've got strong currents that are basically going to scour the ocean floor. So you'll have these open breaks in between any ribbon reef that you would visit. So we kind of discussed here about these component pieces of the Great Barrier Reef. Now, if we look at the organisms that are responsible for their formation, so coral, basically it's just a generic name for about 2,500 species of these very tiny invertebrate animals. Not only are they tiny, they are super simple, and I'll show you the body plan here in a bit. But coral are actually related to jellyfish and sea anemones and any of these other organisms that are very well known for their stinging cells. So in the phylum Cnidaria, these organisms vary greatly in size. In this case, they are extremely tiny, but they are going to be secreting limestone and forming all of these very unique and interesting structures that form reefs. So coral themselves are what we call a polyp. So you have an individual polyp that may be simply millimeters in size. All right? They're extremely tiny. So over time, how do we get a reef from an organism that is simply a millimeter or a few millimeters in size? Well, what they do is they basically clone themselves. So over time, they basically form what we call buds. So these simply just bud out and they pinch off, and you have a genetically identical individual. So think about millions and millions of these little polyps all basically kind of growing out, and while they're doing this, they're laying down kind of this bony skeleton that forms the base of the reef structure. Now, the interesting thing about coral is they not only reproduce asexually through cloning, but they do release, when they need to, they will release egg and sperm to form new coral. And this is actually the only point in their life where they're mobile. So they do have a very short-lived mobile phase where they will move to try to colonize a different area. So they're very simple animals, as I mentioned. So if you were to cut open a jellyfish or sea anemone or a coral, the basic basis of the body is going to be very similar. So we've got a stomach here, or a gastrovascular cavity, kind of what they're showing in either one of these pictures here. So take stomach kind of with a grain of salt. So it's basically a gastrovascular cavity. So these animals have one opening. They have a mouth on the top of the animal. And so this basically serves for feeding and for releasing waste. So a lot of our simple animals, this is how they survive. I talked about stinging cells. So on these animals, you've got a mouth that is surrounded by a series of tentacles, and these tentacles have stinging cells. Now, the one thing about coral, they're not going to reach out and sting you like a jellyfish. So jellyfish and some of the others in this phylum are known to have these very, very aggressive tendencies as far as being able to subdue things like fish. Coral are going to be going after very small microorganisms. So that's going to be part of their feeding. These animals are interesting because they can feed, but they also have a symbiont with them that allow them to photosynthesize. So when you look at some of these coral systems, and you get all of these brilliant colors, that's not the coral. The brilliant colors you get from coral is from their photosynthetic symbiont, okay, this partner that they have. So this photosynthetic symbiont, their partner, is a type of algae. And they basically reside in the tissues of the coral. So the coral are feeding, but they're also gaining energy from the symbiont that's sharing resources with them through photosynthesis. So they're basically kind of have two ways that they can gain energy. So with the symbiosis that they have with the algae, this basically resource sharing, if you will, they can speed up their growth 2 or 3 times what they would if they were just on their own trying to collect microorganisms from the water column. So when I mentioned they're laying down skeletons, I'll talk about this later when I get into ocean acidification, but what they're doing is they're taking this naturally occurring element, calcium carbonate from the water, and they're taking that and converting it into a protective shell or a skeleton for their bodies. So again, over thousands of years, this forms these big reef systems that we see today. Okay, so some background on the reef, background on coral. Now we start looking at the Great Barrier Reef, and we start looking at human impacts. They're all over the place. And in many cases, a lot of the impacts that I'm going to talk about really are going to be global. So they're not just going to be localized to the Great Barrier Reef. But I'll start with human impacts on the Great Barrier Reef itself. So one of the big things that is popular in this area and basically any reef system is going to be fishing. So this could be commercial fishing and this could be recreational. So when we look at these two combined, these have reduced fish stocks probably about 10 times over the last 30 years or so. So we've seen dramatic drops. And again, I do want to point out this is not unique to the Great Barrier Reef. We've seen this across the globe. Another thing that is impacting the reef, and this is again kind of a human-caused problem, is going to be runoff. Anytime you have a system in place where the surrounding coastline was historically forest, and you start to remove forest, what you're going to start to have is sediment that not only runs off locally, but it's going to flow down rivers and streams, and this is going to have to go somewhere. So it flows to the ocean. And when silt and other materials are eroded away from farmland or whatever the land usage is, it basically is deposited then in the ocean. I'll talk about this later as well. Now, just like any large body of water, you're going to be moving resources. So when we look at the Great Barrier Reef, this was and is still a very popular kind of right-of-way for a lot of shipping. So one of the things I have here in my picture, you can see oil and gas. And you can never have shipments without some kind of a spill. So whether you hear about it in the news or not, you always have these maybe small to larger scale oil spills. In addition to that, because of a lot of the resources that are available in Northeast Australia, you have copper, lead, iron. So there's a lot of resources that are mined, and in order to be shipped, they're going to be taken across the Great Barrier Reef out into the open ocean. Another thing that affects the reef, and again, this is not unique necessarily to the Great Barrier Reef, but you have trawling. So not only do you have commercial and residential fishing, but you have this system in place where basically you drop these big nets and you drag it, and basically this scours reef systems. So in this case, primarily what they're going after is shrimp. So if you think about what would be very similar in like the Gulf of Mexico, kind of a similar system, only here, if you're dropping these nets and letting it hit the bottom, this is going to basically not only catch fish and a number of other animals that we're not after, you're going to be tearing up the living system. So you're going to be tearing up the coral. So these are kind of a couple of examples of human kind of caused problems on the reef. Now, when we look at this from the perspective of tourism, probably the most important way that Australia gains monetary resources is through tourism on the Great Barrier Reef. This generates billions of dollars every year. So what we're trying to do, or what is trying to be put into place, is basically certain areas along the Great Barrier Reef that are going to be protected. So still open to tourism, so for fishing, for scuba diving, recreational boating, whatever it might be. But you kind of look at this here, this area here shows you the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And this is kind of divided up into all of these different zones. And so these zones have many functions. You've got areas that are set aside as national parks, those that are for research, those are kind of open usage. So while the Great Barrier Reef is a huge expanse, the government has been able to, at least in certain areas, protect it from overexploitation. Now, start getting into the depressing part of my talk here. And I'm going to spend some time here first talking about probably the greatest threat that we see, not only in the Great Barrier Reef, but any reef system throughout the world. I'm sure at some point in the news, or maybe in a biology class or wherever else, you've heard about coral bleaching. So when we look at coral bleaching, what is coral bleaching? What causes it? Well, when ocean water becomes too warm, what we see is that coral that are normally colorful, brightly colored, they start to turn basically a white or bleached color. And what happens when the temperature rises and ocean water temperatures increase, these coral are going to start to spit out or expel their symbionts. So this is what is going to cause this otherwise very colorful system to become white. So basically what happens, we see bleaching typically on very calm, hot days. So basically we have very little in the way of a current, and so we have temperatures that are keeping water at a very constant, hot temperature. And what happens is the symbiont, this algae, they're photosynthesizing. Well, now they're stimulated because of this extra increase in temperature. You've got probably a lot of excess radiation from the sun that's hitting them, that's stimulating them. So they're going full steam, photosynthesizing. They're producing, as a byproduct, oxygen. Well, oxygen in excess is damaging the tissues. So what happens is the coral, in order to keep its cells from being damaged and basically potentially killing them, they're going to spit out these symbionts. And so by doing this, they're protecting themselves from these damaging oxygen molecules. But they're losing their photosynthetic partner. So if a colony is doing this, we're going to have some problems. Our growth is going to be slow. We're going to open ourselves up to stressors from other things like coral diseases that I'll talk about later. So coral bleaching is an issue here because it can eventually take coral from its healthy state to potentially killing these colonies. So once coral dies, if you have this bleaching, everything that lives there is going to move out. All right? Because up to this point, you've got a structure in place for fish and other vertebrate and invertebrate animals. So it kind of looks like this. It kind of looks like a forest that's been burned out, and there's basically nothing kind of living there. So I want to share with you a short little video that kind of demonstrates what coral bleaching is.
Corals are small animals, but they build structures that you can actually see from space. As we zoom in, we see the reefs where I work, a little island called Ofu in American Samoa. They ridge there, and as we zoom in, we see what those reefs are. Now, the reefs are made of individual coral colonies, like we see now. That coral, then, is actually made up of a whole series of small polyps, they're called. This is a colonial organism And the polyps themselves have all the structures that an animal needs. It has a mouth, it has tentacles, it has gonads, it can live, it can reproduce, it can grow. They're in a colony of genetically identical polyps. Now, the color on these tentacles, like I said, is not the color of the coral itself. It's the color of the symbiont. And as the focus racks in and out a little bit here, then what we see is that we can just see the little globules of the symbiont. Well, let's take a closer look. We'll go into a tentacle and see those. These cells, the symbionts, are not just floating around. They're actually inside the coral cells. Corals are simple. They just have two cell layers, an epidermis and a gastrodermis inside. The symbionts are inside the gastrodermis, and you can see it there. Now, this is a life form called a dinoflagellate. It has chloroplasts because it's photosynthetic, but it has very odd-shaped chloroplasts, like these yellow structures here. We're going to zoom into the chloroplast itself because that's where the damage happens during bleaching. What do chloroplasts have in them? They have membranes called thylakoid membranes. Those membranes hold the proteins called the photosystems that then capture light energy and turn it into chemical energy. It's the molecules that turn all of the sunlight that we get on the planet into the food that we eat. The rain of photons down here hits these photosystems and they gather them up. Now, if the temperature goes up and if the light goes up, then they freak out. There's too much energy, the photosystems break, and they no longer can function the way they do. But the rain of photon keeps going. The energy is still there, and as a consequence, that energy is now turned into reactive oxygen molecules. Those are damaging to cells, so it damages the inside of the symbiont, it damages the inside of the coral cell, and they spit the symbiont out. That spitting of the symbiont out by one coral cell isn't bad, but if the entire colony does it, then that's coral bleaching. What you can see here is simulated of the spitting out of these symbionts and the gradual whitening of this particular part of this particular coral colony. Well, when that happens across an entire colony, then the coral turns from its normal tan color into a white color. What difference does that make? The symbiont provides 75 to 80% of the energy the coral needs to survive, and without that energy, it can't make a skeleton and it can't live very long. So as a consequence, a lot of the corals that bleach eventually die.
Okay, so that's basically kind of at its core what bleaching is and how it's occurring, what is causing it. So as the video kind of pointed out, a bleached coral is not dead yet. However, if we have multiple bleaching events occurring in relatively short periods of time, this will stress these coral out to the point where they can't bounce back. So what we have found that if you have these bleaching events occurring over more spaced or larger time expanses, they can recover. They will take back those symbionts, or the symbionts will kind of move back to recolonize. And this will basically kind of set them back up to go about growing again because they can gain the energy from photosynthesis. The problem that we're seeing is that over the last 30 years or so, bleaching events are occurring annually. And this is not going to be in like every reef system on the planet, but they're going to be occurring frequently. If we look at the Great Barrier Reef, since 1998, we've had 3 major bleaching events. 98, 2002, and by far the largest, most damaging, most decimating one between 2014 and 2017. Within that block of time, 2016 is where we saw 2/3 of the reefs in the northern portion of the Great Barrier Reef die from bleaching. 2016, I don't know if you guys recall or not, the warmest year on record on the planet, at least since we've started recording temperatures for the last 100 or so years. So when we look at what is kind of the extent, so in red here kind of shows you, I was mentioning this 2/3 portion of these reefs that have died. So this is the kind of the largest area of concern and the largest extent, at least in the Great Barrier Reef. If you look kind of towards the south here, you'll see that there's far fewer areas that are being exposed and being reduced by coral bleaching. So we look at research, just over 30 years or so, and what we're finding is that the Great Barrier Reef and a number of areas are being compromised. So as we have coral die-off, we're having fewer and fewer areas that are able to recover. So the International Panel on Climate Change, they have predicted over the next 20 years or so that ocean waters are going to increase in temperature by approximately 2 degrees Celsius. So if we have just a slight increase, it doesn't seem like that's much of a difference as far as warming, but this would be enough to basically set off catastrophic bleaching events. So basically kind of on the scale of what we saw during 2014 and 2017. So, gloom and doom, but not necessarily. So this doesn't necessarily mean that coral are going to go extinct. I mentioned that coral, even though we think of them as adults, as sedentary organisms, they do have mobility as far as their young or their juvenile stage. What we would predict, again, this is all based on speculation, is that we could see reefs that we have currently shift going north and south as we go from very warm, inhospitable areas to the port or towards the poles where water would be cooler. However, more gloom and doom. We, as a species, are really radically modifying the planet, and we've been doing this at kind of the extent over about 50 years or so. So we are surpassing what we would look at kind of would be normal standards. So on a geological scale, we are basically forcing different issues such as ocean temperature rising and carbon dioxide and such in the atmosphere. So it's not clear. Are these organisms going to be able to keep up with how we are kind of pressing the planet with different issues? Or if they can't, will these reef systems basically deteriorate? So in addition to coral bleaching, we look at some of these other issues that are impacting the Great Barrier Reef. So I talked a little bit earlier about water quality. I was talking about runoff from agriculture and such. So if we look at this, so going back to the 1860s, so again, this is nothing new, we look at coastal development. So coastal development, again, if you visit northeast Australia, historically this region was made up of subtropical rainforest. So this is an area that was historically forested. Again, we start clearing land for agriculture, pasture, and whatever other land use we may have. This opens up the soil to being eroded away. So if you have all of this sediment washing away, it has to go somewhere, and where it goes is not only into the ocean, but it's going to be dumped right on these fringing reefs that are out there near the coastline. So you have fringing reefs being covered in silt. You have seagrass beds. And basically all those communities that once had diversity of organisms basically are smothered. So instead of having systems that are capable now of recovering, they're just basically kind of dumped on with silt and such. Okay, another huge problem, probably just as huge of a problem as coral bleaching, is going to be ocean acidification. So I mentioned a couple slides back about carbon dioxide levels increasing. So this is an issue not just because carbon dioxide goes to the atmosphere. A lot of carbon dioxide actually sinks into the ocean. So the ocean actually acts as kind of a sponge for a lot of the carbon dioxide that's produced. So when carbon dioxide goes into the ocean and it dissolves, it goes through a number of reactions. I'm not a chemist, and I'm not going to sit here and try to explain them to you, but as we add carbon dioxide to the ocean, we make it more acidic because we're basically creating bicarbonate. So by doing this, coral on their usual routine, can take calcium carbonate, which is freely available in the ocean, and they use that for making limestone. However, you add carbon dioxide and you have bicarbonate produced, coral have to expend more energy because they have to pluck an extra hydrogen off of this molecule. So they're expending more energy. So they can't grow as fast. So what we see is that coral are not only growing slower and trying to recover, they're becoming weaker because of this very slow growth and the energy needs to produce limestone from bicarbonate. So not only is this an issue for coral, obviously that's what I'm kind of talking about here, but if you look at a lot of the microorganisms that photosynthesize in the ocean, they're also using calcium carbonate to form some kind of protective covering on their bodies. So it's affecting their growth, it's affecting their ability to sustain populations. Okay, sea level changes. Been hearing about this probably a lot too, about ocean levels rising. Well, how would this affect the coral reef? Wouldn't that be a good thing, right? Because we're having more water. Not necessarily. If you look at kind of my little schematic here, and you look at kind of present day where you have our established reef systems today, if you start to see sea levels rise, and this could be a very small amount, this could be maybe about 1.5 feet. You're basically now increasing the distance that sunlight has to travel for photosynthesis to occur in coral and these other photosynthesizing organisms. So what this means is that at these lower depths, these coral that now cannot get sunlight, they're going to die off unless they can basically, and the rest of these individual corals can basically kind of migrate up to keep pace with levels of ocean rise. So what this means is if coral cannot keep pace with sea level rise, you're going to have parts of these reefs, these lower reaches, that are going to die off because they simply cannot use the energy or trap the energy from the sun. Weather. So Hurricane Durian is in the news right now. Massive storm in the Atlantic. What, again, a lot of models predict is that, I don't care if you're in the northern or the southern hemisphere, you're going to have increases in the intensity of storms. So things like microbursts, cyclones, typhoons, and then in the northern hemisphere, hurricanes. So if you have these storms that are increasing in intensity, they're not only going to have influences in the ocean, but they're going to have consequences on the coastlines. So I've already talked about sediment runoff. So you're going to have huge surges, storm surges, not only going inland, but then flowing back out. So if this is the case, not only are we going to have outflow of materials from these surges, you're also going to have currents that are going to be basically moving and redepositing or resuspending sediments. This is going to have influences on these reef-building organisms, and then all of those other organisms that are dependent on it for protection. Coral diseases. So we didn't think it could get worse, right? Coral bleaching, ocean acidification. Well, now we find that there are at least 30 diagnosed diseases with coral. You're thinking, how is it, why are we trying to diagnose diseases for these little invertebrate animals? Well, they get them, right? We get bacteria, we get bugs. They are not immune to them like anything else. So once coral becomes stressed, whether it's because of bleaching or whatever it might be, they become susceptible to pathogenic bacteria. And these bacteria attack these individual polyps. And you'll kind of see some pictures here of some of these, what some of these diseases look like. So they can pick up or develop tumors just like we could. They develop black band from areas of basically necrosis. So they start to slowly die in a circular fashion, starting from a center point. So a healthy coral can fight off bacteria and they won't succumb to diseases. But if you have coral that are bleached and are recovering from being bleached, that's when they become susceptible. just like a person would if your immune system is compromised. Now to kind of wrap up my talk, looking at the future. So when we look at a coral reef system, they are basically one of these indicators of global health. So what I mean by this is that if we look at a coral reef system stressed or dying, we use this as an indicator that something or some things are not right in the ocean. So we have several indicators that we look at on kind of the mainland. So this is one of these that we can actually use in the ocean. So I've talked about the problems. So they face climate change, which completely out of their hands. Water quality, ocean acidification. To a lesser extent for coral, but the system as a whole would be overfishing and poaching. So these are basically factors that are going to affect their ability to survive. And not only survive, but adapt. So when I was mentioning earlier about coral recovering, but also recolonizing. So their ability to shift ranges. So the Great Barrier Reef, again, is not alone in this. So every reef system that has been studied around the planet is showing signs of stress, from potentially low stress to areas like the Great Barrier Reef where there's going to be high stress. So when we see these bleaching events, this is not only affecting the coral, but this is going to affect the diversity. Because as I mentioned, all the organisms that live amongst these reef systems, they disappear as well. So we lose the fish, we lose the sponges, we lose the algae, we lose basically everything that is a part of these systems. What we're seeing is these areas of high die-off where we had coral bleaching is instead of the coral being able to recolonize, you have algae or sponges that actually move in and start to fill in these voids. The problem is, over time, once coral die, these start to erode. So just like anything else, you have strong ocean currents working on it. There's no coral in here to keep regenerating or restructuring their skeleton. So reefs will break down if they die. So if we look at the future, the Great Barrier Reef or otherwise, it is speculative at best. One thing that we have a lot of are models. And I'm not going to share any with you because I don't like models. But if you look at climate change models, if you look at sea level rise models, I've given you some of the numbers both for how climate change is increasing the temperature of the ocean and how sea level rise, even in short measurements, can impact these reefs. Some of the things that we are seeing that can be effective at moving coral, we have what we call coral farming or coral restoration. So we can actually grow coral in areas like this in shallow ocean waters. We can transplant them. So if we have sea level rise, it is, or we have the potential to take living coral and transplant them. Another thing that you have seen and that may be effective is these artificial reefs, where we submerge man-made structures and coral colonize. So it is possible we can also do this on larger scales to recreate reefs just by using human-made structures. So we potentially have the ability to combat some of the issues that coral are facing. Obviously, things like ocean acidification and bleaching are issues that we may be at a point where we've kind of already gone past the cusp, and it's going to be very difficult to try to reverse the acidity, for example, of the